Hi, Bobcats. So excited to be bringing you our third 9 Weeks Awards. I know that all of our Bobcats have been working very hard, and it is exciting to be able to celebrate some kids who have been putting forth their best effort and showing great leadership. Remember that if your name's not called in this video, it's okay. You have another opportunity to work really hard during the fourth 9 weeks. Let's find out who our award winners are. Our first category is leadership. These are students that are doing a great job in the classroom and setting a great example for their classmates. In pre-K, Miss Ishley's class, we have Avery. In Miss Darden's class, Cohen. Miss Gregory's class, Creasy. Mrs. Kerner's class, Brenna. Mrs. Lazarus's class, Chloe. Mrs. Munoz's class, Court. Mrs. Shank's class, Zoe. And from Miss Bergman's class, Jackson. Great job, guys. In first grade, from Miss Howell's class, Nicholas. From Mrs. McLeod's class, Liberty. From Mrs. McDermott's class, William. From Mrs. Oschlager's class, Wesley. From Miss Shively's class, Camille. From Mrs. Stark's class, Jackson. And from Mrs. Threadgill's class, Owen. Our leaders in second grade are, from Mrs. Dameron's class, Sylvie. From Mrs. Davis's class, Jacqueline. From Miss Hurley's class, Chloe. From Mrs. Furman's class, Peyton. From Mrs. Register's class, Nathan. And from Miss Williams's class, Jace. In third grade, we have from Mrs. Connor's class, Amelia. From Mrs. Ferris's class, Aaron. From Mr. Jones's class, Ariana. From Mrs. Schmidt's class, Cole. From Mrs. Tucker's class, Blake. From Mrs. Vix's class, Savannah. And from Mrs. Widener's class, Daisy. We have some leaders in fourth grade. From Mrs. Craven's class, Hadley. From Miss Ganaway's class, Evelina. From Mr. Lassiter's class, Hannah. From Mrs. Picnic's class, Mason. From Mrs. Ryan's class, Gideon. And from Mrs. Wells's class, Gunner. In fifth grade, from Mrs. Akos's class, Lila. From Miss Bowie's class, Harper. From Mrs. Duricky's class, Alyssa. From Mrs. Doherty's class, Victoria. And from Mr. Griffith's class, Dresden. Great job, fifth grade. Our next category is best effort. The students receiving these awards are students that persevere, they give their best effort even when things get tough. From pre-K, we have Henry. In kindergarten, from Mrs. Darden's class, Rex. In Miss Gregory's class, Dylan. In Mrs. Kerner's class, Milan. From Mrs. Lazarus' class, Camille. From Mrs. Munoz's class, Brianna. And from Mrs. Shank's class, Schlote. In first grade, from Mrs. Howell's class, Avery Kate. In Mrs. McLeod's class, Maura. In Mrs. McDermott's class, Briella. In Mrs. Oschlager's class, Abel. In Miss Shively's class, Gabriel. In Mrs. Stark's class, Jordan. And from Mrs. Threadgill's class, Cecilia. In second grade, our students showing great effort are from Miss Dameron's class, Caroline. In Mrs. Davis's class, Camila. In Miss Hurley's class, Riker. In Mrs. Furman's class, Bodie. In Mrs. Register's class, Chloe. And in Miss Williams' class, Maya. In third grade, from Mrs. Connor's class, Yassine. In Mrs. Ferris's class, Ben. In Mr. Jones's class, Maya. In Mrs. Schmidt's class, Sawyer. In Mrs. Tucker's class, Rebecca. In Mrs. Vix's class, Cash. And in Mrs. Widener's class, Calvin. Our students in fourth grade being recognized for their effort are from Mrs. Craven's class, Jason. From Miss Ganaway's class, Nina. From Mr. Lassiter's class, Jordan. From Mrs. Picnic's class, Tommy. From Mrs. Ryan's class, Hayden. And from Mrs. Wells's class, Eva. In fifth grade, from Mrs. Akos's class, Tyler. From Miss Bowie's class, Maddie. From Mrs. Duricky's class, Emma. From Mrs. Doherty's class, Elijah. From Mr. Griffith's class, Uriah. And from Miss Bergman's class, Jonathan. Our last category is best effort in special area. And our special area teachers have a really hard time selecting just one student from each grade level. Best effort in PE goes to, from kindergarten, Dean in Miss Lazarus's class and Bryson from Mrs. Kerner's class. First grade, Cardi in Mrs. Threadgill's class and Nawal in Miss Stark's class. In second grade, Keegan in Mrs. Furman's class and Ella in Miss Williams' class. In third grade, Ben from Mrs. Ferris's class and Reagan from Mrs. Vix's class. In fourth grade, Samuel in Mrs. Picnic's class, Centonio in Miss Bergman's class, and Pahal from Mr. Lassiter's class. In fifth grade, we have Sloan from Mrs. Akos' class and Jordan from Miss Pooey's class. In art from kindergarten, we have Kevin from Mrs. Darden's class. In first grade, Jaden from Miss Howell's class. In second grade, Fisher from Mrs. Register's class. In third grade, Willow from Mrs. Ferris's class. In fourth grade, Sasha from Mrs. Craven's class. And in fifth grade, Emma from Mrs. Doherty's class. Best effort in music goes to, from kindergarten, Cameron in Miss Gregory's class. In first grade, Levi in Mrs. McDermott's class. In second grade, Ethan in Miss Dameron's class. In third grade, Merrill from Mrs. Tucker's class. In fourth grade, Helen from Mrs. Ryan's class. And in fifth grade, Brooke from Mr. Griffith's class. Best effort in media goes to, from kindergarten, Mila in Mrs. Munoz's class. In first grade, Gloria in Mrs. Threadgill's class. In second grade, Dominic in Miss Hurley's class. In third grade, Mary Alice in Mrs. Tucker's class. Fourth grade, Peyton in Miss Ganaway's class. And in fifth grade, River from Mr. Griffith's class. Best effort in guidance goes to, from kindergarten, Maxwell in Mrs. Munoz's class. First grade, Jackson in Mrs. Stark's class. In second grade, Radhika in Mrs. Davis's class. Best effort in STEM goes to, in third grade, Lawson in Mrs. Vix's class. Fourth grade, Ryan in Mrs. Wells's class. And fifth grade, Trenton in Mrs. Doherty's class. Great job, Bobcats. I know that you guys are working super hard, and it's great to be able to recognize you for your efforts. We've got one more 9 weeks left in this school year. Let's keep up the good work, and let's see who will be next to be recognized. Have a great day.